Ben Garland or Wes Schweitzer, and then they're going to have Sean Harlow. And then I could see them with like Andreas Knapp or Napier or whatever, or Will Freeman as the other swing tackle. But other than that, like, who else are they going to have on the offensive line on the roster? Because they only carried 8 all last year, and I think they're going to do that again this year. So unless they go to 9 guys, I don't see a way that, like, Keizer gets on the roster or, like, Averill will get on the roster. And I think out of those all those guys, Keizer's the guy because he's the athletic guy. He's the athletic type of body and build, and he's got that nasty streak that you really want from a center in the zone scheme.
Tim, do you have any thoughts on Trevor Robinson's retirement and how it may affect the Falcons' training camp battle?
I think Scott pretty much nailed it. They don't carry a lot of linemen, especially inside. I think that may be an area they do need to address, whether it's Keizer or somebody else. Alex Mack played on a broken leg, like you can only ask him to do that one time, I think. So it would be nice to have a little bit more depth behind him and maybe someone who can play like either guard spot and inside. I don't know who it may be, but I think it would be definitely, I wouldn't say it's a luxury, but that would be a very nice thing for them to find somebody who they're confident in to take over that role at some point during these next few weeks here.
Okay. All right, let's move on to a little bit more pressing issues. Well, maybe not necessarily pressing, but the reports came out earlier this week that the Falcons are hoping that they can get Devontae Freeman under contract before Thursday practices begin. I guess the first question, and Tim, I'm curious what you think about this. Do you think that is going to happen? And if it does, then, what are your thoughts about that?
I think he's going to get paid. I think he's definitely earned it. If you look at his numbers over the last 2 years, I think he's number 1 in yards from scrimmage total, extremely efficient. He does everything he has to. He played very well in the Super Bowl, these big situations. He's done everything you can possibly want, and he deserves to be paid like an elite running back. He's not going to get Le'Veon Bell kind of money. He's kind of an outlier because of Adrian Peterson's prior contract with Minnesota, but he deserves as much as LaShawn McCoy or anybody else. So he may crack $10 million a year over 5 years. It sounds like a lot of money, but he's earned it. If they structure it right, given the way the salary cap is rising every year, I don't think it's going to be a problem. He's not going to really drag down the salary cap or anything. He's pretty much worth that. So hopefully it does, and I would be surprised if they don't get, if not necessarily by Thursday, at least in the next several days, maybe the next week or so, the first few days of training camp.
Okay. Scott, thoughts?
I think they should do it. I think it's going to be done probably Thursday morning when they're walking in the door. They'll be like, oh, hey, we've got this contract for Devontae. He's signing it as he's walking in the door.
Okay. Yeah, the interesting thing about this is when Roddy was coming up with his extension a couple of years ago, I didn't think it would happen. I didn't think it would happen on the eve of training camp, and it did. When Julio's contract came up, 2 years ago, I thought it was going to happen on the eve of training camp, and it didn't. So I don't think this is going to happen on Thursday. So that probably means it will happen on Thursday. But even if it doesn't, it's a situation where it'll probably eventually get done, whether it's 3 days into camp or, Monday or Tuesday or next Thursday or something like that. So it's one of those decisions that, personally, I'm not a huge fan of giving running backs second contracts. But for Devontae, I'm more than willing to make an exception. It really just sort of comes down to how much money he gets and sort of looking at some of the top salaries. It was interesting, Tim, that you mentioned Le'Veon Bell, because the reports about the contract he just turned down from the Steelers, he turned down a massive deal, and I wonder if that's going to affect maybe where Devontae Freeman's negotiation stand is, because Bell's contract is like way higher than what Shady McCoy's contract is, or at least the one the Steelers offered him. And Bell turned that down largely because there wasn't a lot of guaranteed money after the first year, as opposed to it wasn't a lot of money that they were going to be willing to pay him. So it'll be interesting to see what the final numbers wind up being like. I'm expecting it to be somewhere around $7 or $8 million a year. probably in that $15 to $20 million a year range in terms of guaranteed money. And, I think he's certainly worth that type of price tag. So, yeah. We did get a question from Evan Birchfield about Devontae's contract, and shout out to Evan Birchfield, recent guest of the Locked On Falcons podcast. But he asked, what kind of contract can we expect from Freeman, and how does that affect the cap? I just gave my answer, so what are your thoughts?
So personally, I have, if I was going to do this contract myself, I'd give him 5 years, $42 million, 42 and a half. And then you do have to factor in the current, I think it's 1.8 million or 1.72 million in salary, and then 1.1 or 121K in bonus that's left. So you got to factor all that in. I would just set it all up as a signing bonus, give him $1 million salary this year, so it's real low on the cap hit this year. Push the cap hit to be the biggest in 19, 20, and 21, and then have a somewhat lower cap hit in 2022. Basically structure it like it's a mini version of Matt Ryan's deal, like a $40 million version of what Ryan signed back in 2013, where the money's basically the same every year. He just has to play through the contract and he's good. The cash is the same, but the way it hits the cap isn't the same.
Okay. Tim, do you have any additional thoughts in terms of contract specifics?
I think it all comes down to the guaranteed money. I mean, that's an obvious thing to say, but there's a reason Bell walked away from that massive offer he got away from the Steelers. I wonder how he's going to feel about that a few years from now, depending on what he gets in his next deal. That was a lot of money to turn down, but the guaranteed is the thing that matters, right? Especially running backs, they burn out quickly. You made a fair point about giving running backs second contracts. Can you imagine Bill Belichick doing that for someone, even if it is Devonta Freeman and the numbers that he's put up? There's reasons why that doesn't. A lot of front offices don't particularly like investing that kind of money in those guys. So, it's a delicate balance act to go in there, but you need to make an offer that's not disrespectful to him, but also you need to think about the team's long-term future. And remember that you have Tevin Coleman behind him as well, so they do have some leverage.
Yeah, good point there. All right, let's get into training camp. And let's start off. Let's talk about some of the positional battles. The interesting thing about this year's training camp is, when you're looking at least at the starting lineup, not a whole lot of sort of, heated sort of big time, I guess the best word is sexy position battles, because it's like fullback, right guard, weak side linebacker, maybe the base Leo in the base defense. Outside of that, you're not really looking at a whole lot of starting positions where you expect much change there. I'm sort of curious, Tim, if you're looking at any one of these battles at the starting lineup, maybe even one that I did not mention, that you may feel differently about that than I do. But any one of these starting battles sort of pique your interest, or is it just I'm curious who wins the job, but for a lot of these positions, it's pretty much some of these guys are interchangeable?
For a lot of them, there are. Right guard is the most important one for sure, but as you said, it's not a very sexy position battle to go. To me, I love kick returner. I think who knows how much longer they're going to be in the NFL in 10 years. Will there still be kick and punt returns? We don't know. So I think you got to enjoy them while you can. Eric Williams was obviously a little bit disappointing last year, some of his decisions he made, and maybe he lost a step, maybe or not. But there's a lot of really fast guys on this team. You have Taylor Gabriel, you have Andre Roberts, you have Coleman. You have a lot of really, really fast players on this team. That's what Dan Quinn's all about, speed. So that's definitely something that I'm going to be looking out for, and that can be, that's a huge thing. You can flip the field, with a dynamic returner like that in Devin Hester a couple of years ago. If you can get a guy like that, or even somewhere close to what he was in his prime, that's a huge weapon. You can't forget about that.
Boy,
Scott,
yeah. I mean, kick returner is definitely going to be an important battle. I do think Andre ends up winning it regardless. But I don't know, man. There's a lot of big battles on this roster that may not be. I guess if you're looking at the roster, you're not going to see it right away. But like weak side linebacker, you will see Duke Riley. I think you're going to see Duke Riley win. Like right guard, you're going to see Wes Schweitzer win. I think Tyler Renew beats out Derek Coleman. And I think in base, I think Reed's going to play in the base
which is
for a
the
little
site
bit.
that Scott also contributes to.
Taking over that job.
Fair. Yeah, I mean, for me, like it's to me looking at some of these battles. I don't know, like the fullback position. Like I think probably Derek Coleman will probably win that job. But even if whoever is that guy, honestly, I'm not really I don't have high expectations for that player because I don't necessarily look at either Coleman or Renew as guys that you're going to make a significant part of the offense. So, like, you know, it wouldn't shock me at all if the guy who wins that battle is not the guy who's playing that position by year's end. And I think a lot of these battles will be interesting more so not necessarily for who wins the gig in week 1, but who has the gig in week 17. In the case of weak side linebacker, like I expect Devondre Campbell to be the week 1 guy, but I don't really expect him to be the week 17 guy. It's the same thing with Brooks Reed and Tack McKinley at that Leo spot. I think Brooks Reed will probably be the week 1 guy, but, you know, the expectation is definitely Tack, you know, by week 17 and probably a lot earlier than that will probably be the guy that getting the majority of snaps at that position. So, you know, I think these battles are interesting in the sense, you know, I think the right guard battle is probably the one that's the most critical of them because if between Wes Schweitzer and Ben Garland, if that position becomes a problem area, if neither one of those guys live up to expectations, which aren't, you know, extraordinarily high, but at least, you know, the expectation is that they will be at least mildly competent NFL starters. You know, that could be a bigger issue, but for the rest of the positions, I think it's just basically,
hey guys, welcome back.
We know what Brooks Reed is. We don't necessarily know what Campbell is, but we have a better idea at this point of what he is than what Duke Riley is. But for both of those guys, they're young guys that the future is bright. So even if they don't quite, you know, meet expectations, we can still have a reasonable assumption that in the future they're going to still be good. So any sort of hiccups or ups and downs that they experienced this year are more than fine as part of their developmental process. So, you know, fullback we'll have to see. But you know, I think this is an interesting trade, Kim, because it just seems to me a little bit more low key in terms of compared to previous years under Dan Quinn, just because you seem to, at least from my perspective, it seems to have a few more roster spots locked up than before. You're not going to have as much of a heated competition because I don't think there's as much room for some of the new guys to come in because, once again, we do have a Super Bowl caliber roster, so it's not as if, you know, it's going to be completely turned upside down this upcoming summer. So it'll be interesting to see how things play out. But I think this is one of the more low-key summers that we've seen, at least in recent memory, with the Falcons. Now, we talked a little bit about the starters, and, you know, let's move to some of the depth spots. And we got a question about this one specifically, so we'll start things off. Once again, from Evan Birchfield, he asked, the Falcons' third-string running back will be blank. Tim, who do you think? Okay, Scott gave his answer. Tim, who do you think will be the third-string running back for the Falcons this year?
I'm having a tough time with this one, to be honest. I wrote something this morning about surprise cuts, and I listed Brian Hill as one of them, but like 6 hours later, I was like, no, it's going to be Teron Ward. I honestly don't know. Like, you do know Devonta Freeman and Tevin Coleman are absolutely going nowhere. So, you know, even though Brian Hill, he's a little bit bigger, he may be a little more athletic than Teron Ward, I don't think you can necessarily just assume he's going to win that competition. Ward has 2 years on the playbook on him. You know, he knows the system. He's been here before, and a lot of rookies have a hard time adjusting to life in the NFL. I think I would be surprised if Hill really flames out and gets cut early, but he wouldn't be the first guy for that to happen to. You know, at the moment, my guess is going to be Brian Hill, even though I'm contradicting myself from earlier today. Tomorrow, I may be Ward. I don't know. I'm useless here. I don't know.
Okay. All right. Yeah, no, I think it's going to be Brian Hill. I'm probably higher on Teron Ward than probably most. So I do think he stands a good shot at as making it as the fourth running back, and I do think there's a better chance that probably people think that both Hill and Ward make the team. It was interesting that this is an issue because of what seemingly Vaughn McClure wrote last week about who he had projecting making the roster, and instead of Hill or Ward being that third string running back, he had B.J. Daniels, who was making the transition from wide receiver. He was a quarterback in college. He's sort of in the mix for the kick return job, so that can certainly help his chances if he shows out there, because he has some experience returning punts in the NFL. So it'll be interesting that this is a competition that I think probably a month ago, or not even a month ago, 2 weeks ago, 100% of people would have been like, yeah, Brian Hill's a lock. Maybe Teron Ward, B.J. Daniels, maybe a practice squad guy again. And that's basically, there's no drama here. But, just because of one article, basically, it seems to have thrown that sort of expectation a little bit topsy-turvy. So we'll see how things play out. But, I sort of still expect the same thing I expected 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, I think Brian Hill's going to easily win that job. And it's just, it's really, really easy to see. You don't take a guy in the 5th round and then just cut him right away, unless he's just a total douche off the field.
Oh, okay. I mean, yeah, I guess that's a possibility. Let's move on to some of the other skill positions, and I do think these battles, at least going into the summer, we thought were going to be a little bit more heated than the backup running back position, and that is the depth at wide receiver and tight end, primarily similar to the running back position at the bottom of the depth chart, where you have at wide receiver, you have guys like Andre Roberts and Devin Fuller and Nick Williams. I guess, I'm sure some people think that, Justin Hardy isn't a lock, so maybe he deserves to be thrown into that mix as well. You got tight end, you have Eric Saubert, who is another draft pick of the Falcons, going up against guys like Josh Perkins and DJ Tialavea and Darian Griswold. And so among those, each of those spots, you might have at least one, if not two guys making the team. So I'm curious, Tim, which one of these positions are you watching more closely, and do you have any thoughts on some of these position battles?
I think tight end is definitely more interesting. I know Scott getting a little tip today on Twitter, a guy who says the Falcons had a depth problem at wide receiver, which we all know is completely absurd. You have Julio, you have Sanu, you have Gabriel. It's probably the best 1, 2, 3 in the NFL. Justin Hardy's very good, but as deep as they are, he may see 15 targets. Who knows? Who knows how Sarkisian's going to divide up these kind of things. But tight end is definitely kind of much more open. You assume Austin Hooper is going to take a big leap forward. If he gets Jacob Tammy's targets that we're all, assuming he's the top tight end this year, he could have some really respectable numbers. Saubert apparently he endeared himself to Coach Quinn. That should give him a leg up. And Toilolo just signed, I think, a 3-year deal. So you have 3 pretty young, pretty talented guys. You don't have a superstar there, but there's room to move up. You don't feel like any one of them is necessarily like on the cutting floor right now. There's no Jimmy Graham here, obviously. And there's no Gronk, but you have a good baseline of young talent there. So I think that's going to be pretty interesting to see how that plays out.
Scott, where are you weighing on this?
I mean, I agree with him there. I do like Hooper. I think Hooper's got potential to be on that Jason Witten level if he gets it fully together. But I don't think we see him at that level until year 3.
Are you saying young Jason Witten or old Jason Witten?
Young Jason Witten before his knees totally gave out and he can move about as fast as you do.
Okay. So, Hall of Fame Jason Witten then.
Yeah, I think he's got that kind of potential. Now, do I think he's going to get that good that fast? I mean, probably not. I think he might be like a poor man's Witten where he gets 600, 700 yards every year and is basically like a bigger algae. But that still works.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting with Hooper. He's getting a lot of sort of late buzz going into the season. People talking him about as a fantasy sleeper. People talking about him up as a sort of breakout candidate. And when you look at this offense, of the guys, you can't necessarily list too many guys that are really sort of strong candidates. And he, even if you weren't big on him, he definitely wins that contest by default. But it'll be interesting to see sort of how this depth goes, because I think, the interesting thing at the wide receiver position for me is going to be sort of what growth, if any, Devin Fuller shows this year. And sort of he had a solid summer, but basically he was drafted to be the kick return guy. And I don't necessarily know if he's shown at any point going back to his days at UCLA or last summer in training camp, whether he's shown enough ability as a wide receiver to sort of justify the Falcons keeping him, to develop him as a wide receiver. He just seems sort of more, no offense to him, but sort of more a dime a dozen sort of wide receiver that you don't necessarily feel like you need to invest 3 or 4 years because it's going to pay off down the road. So if he doesn't win that kick return job, does that mean that, does that cancel any chance that he has of making the roster? So I think the interesting thing is, A, is he going to be able to win that kick return job? And B, if not, then will he show enough as a wide receiver to sort of justify still keeping him around on the roster at least? I think he's a very good candidate to be on the practice squad regardless. The tight end position is going to be interesting too, because Saubert and Perkins are sort of competing for that number 3 job. I think both those guys have a lot of upside. I do wonder though, however, if Hooper, the depth behind Hooper, I'm a little concerned about that. I know Toilolo is a solid role player, but if he's your starting tight end, I think, we've seen that in the past, that you basically don't really have much of a factor in the tight end position if he's going to start for you. So I do think it's important that both Saubert or Perkins really sort of show something this summer to sort of give us some hope that in the event that Hooper, may miss a game here or there, that we will still have something at that tight end position that can still be a viable option in the passing game. So it'll be interesting to see how those position battles go. And it'll be fun to see what those guys can do, in some of the second halves of some of those preseason games. Now, a position that I think is a pretty big concern, we touched on it a little bit earlier with the Trevor Robinson retirement. But, outside of whoever is the loser of that right guard position, the Falcons really don't have any proven depth at any spot on their offensive line. Obviously, they're very optimistic about Sean Harlow's future. But, particularly the tackle position, where they have a bunch of green, undrafted rookies competing for that spot. You got Kevin Graff and Marquise Lucas, who've, been in NFL camps but haven't really made an NFL roster. Andreas Knapp, Daniel Brunskill, Will Freeman are all undrafted rookies, all talented players that you could sort of see as developmental options down the road. But it really just sort of depends on if they can sort of live up to that potential. Scott, what do you sort of think about the competition there? And I know you've mentioned that you think Andreas Knappe, I'm sorry, I should get the proper Danish pronunciation. You see him as the front runner, but do you see if any of these other guys could really challenge him for that spot?
The only other guy that I think has a shot there is Will Freeman, but honestly, I think it's Knappe's job to lose. I think Brunskill's way too small. I think Freeman's honestly too small, and I don't think Graff is any good. This could be a spot where Atlanta says, you know what, we need a swing tackle. Ryan Clady's just out there, and they go, hey, you want to make $1 million this year? And they bring him in and be that swing tackle. Because it's not like Atlanta's offense is going to be really tough for him to learn after playing in the Denver offenses that he did for years under Kubiak.
Interesting. Yeah. Tim, what are your thoughts on sort of the Falcons bringing in a veteran?
I'm going to be diverging here, but I think the depth on the offensive line, you mentioned Knapp and Sean Harlow. Depth on the offensive line, I think, is something that got exposed in the Super Bowl. They couldn't run behind Mack with his leg. Schrader went down the fourth quarter. That was a big reason why, Shanahan gets a lot of grief for not calling run plays, which maybe he should, but he was definitely limited by the injuries they had up front there, and I don't know that they've done enough to address that. Look what happened to Carolina last year. Their depth on offensive line was exposed. Cam Newton got beat up, and that destroyed their season. Falcons were very fortunate last season to have all 5 starters, play all 16 games. It doesn't happen very often. You have to expect that's going to regress to the mean a little bit this year. So depth, especially at tackle, if Andreas Knapp works out, that would be ideal. Maybe Graff, one of these other guys, can surprise us. But this will be an area of concern for me, definitely going there. That may be something that's flying under the radar that could be exposed. One guy goes down, can have a sort of domino effect. We may see that play out.
You raised some good points, Tim. I think the Falcons have had all 5 starters start 16 games. I think only twice in this century. So the odds are pretty stacked against them that we're going to see one of these backups at some point this year. In terms of bringing it,
wood.
There you go. I don't have any wood near me. I think it'll be interesting. I'm not expecting Ryan Clady to come here just because I think Ryan Clady's at a point in his career where he has a ring, and why would he come to ride the bench for cheap money? But I do think that is a position where the Falcons could sort of scour the waiver wire when we get a little bit later in the summer to see if there's any better options, because I do think, Tim, you raised some good points about sort of the depth and the likelihood that depth will be challenged this year. Obviously, if it means Ben Garland or Wes Schweitzer winds up starting, whoever does not win that starting right guard spot, it's going to be reasonably okay. If it means Sean Harlow gets some early reps, and that certainly will help his development. But it is a concern where Jake Matthews has been injured 3 out of the 2 out of the 3 years he's been in the league, and Ryan Schrader has been relatively healthy, but he did suffer that injury in the Super Bowl, and it proved pretty costly for the Falcons. So we'll see how it turns out, but that is a position where I'll definitely be keeping a lot of my attention in the preseason games to see if any of these guys emerge and sort of show that they are worthy of being the guy that could sort of be the difference between Matt Ryan being sacked 20 times or Matt Ryan being sacked 40 times this year. So we'll see how it goes. Let's switch over to the defense. I don't know if there's really a position battle along the defensive line. I'm curious if you guys are looking at anything. I guess for me, the only position that I'm sort of looking at is who's going to be the primary defensive tackle next to Grady Jarrett when the Falcons feel like they want to spell Dontari Poe in a nickel. Is it going to be Adrian Claiborne, which I think at some point it probably will once Takk McKinley's ready. But in the meantime, is it going to be Jack Crawford? Is it going to be Derek Shelby? Is it going to be Courtney Upshaw? Is it going to be Rashid Hageman? That's the most intriguing battle for me, at least with the defensive line. Do you guys have any other defensive line battles or that you're looking at, or is that the one that you guys are keyed in on?
Honestly, I think it's going to end up being you're going to have on the base, you're going to have like Brooks Reed, Poe, Jarrett, and then blanking right now. Derek Shelby there in the base. And I think in the nickel, you're going to have Claiborne, Rashid Hageman, Jarrett / Poe, depending on how they're rotating them. And then on the other end, obviously, Beasley.
Tim, what are your thoughts on sort of the positional battles on the defensive line?
I think we can assume McKinley. I read an article last week that said he's a bust candidate. I would be very, very surprised if that happens. I think you can write him in to be that other star in the end where Freeney was last year. Beasley on the other side, and then Poe is going to, I assume, not play every third down. I think, for my money, Claiborne is the best guy to take over in nickel spots there. Shelby maybe, but he's a little bit older. He's had a little bit more injury problems in his career, so it may be tough for him to do. I think he needs to get off to a good start here at this camp these first few days. But I would say Claiborne there. But that line is stacked. There's a lot of good position battles there if you think about it. I mean, it's the starters, who they're going to be in the base. But, other than that, you have a lot of talented guys. It's just such a big contrast. A couple of years ago, this defensive line was worthless. It was probably the weakest unit on the team. And now it's, they are built up here. They have a good problem in that Quinn's going to have some tough decisions to make here before the season starts.
Okay. Now, moving on to the other areas of the defense, are there any position battles at linebacker that you guys are looked into, or do you feel like that's a position? I mean, we've talked about Duke Riley versus Devondre Campbell, but we know both of those guys are going to play regardless. So even if one, basically they're fighting over who's going to be the guy that's going to be an every down player, who's going to be the guy that only plays a third of the snaps. That's basically the battle. But is there any position battles at that linebacker spot that you are looking at, Tim?
I think the obvious one, Deion Jones isn't going anywhere. So it's either Campbell or Riley. And my understanding is that they want to move Campbell over to the strong side, which I think he's probably better suited for. And Riley's going to take over a weak side. I don't know. Depending on the package, I think Riley is just too fast. I think his natural skill set is just going to give him an advantage over Campbell if it's between those two for those particular snaps there. He's really fast. He's pretty much a Deion Jones clone. So that makes you very excited about what he can do. So God forbid something happens to Deion Jones, you have him there, and then you swing back Campbell to the weak side and do what you can over at the other side. But it's a very, very fast, really young linebacker group. But that weak side one is going to be very interesting how they decide to play that.
Scott, you got any thoughts on the competition at linebacker?
I mean, let's look at the depth. At weak side, I'm predicting Duke Riley, and then you're going to have Kamal Ishmael behind him. In the middle, you've got Deion Jones, and then behind him, you've got Leroy Reynolds. And then on the strong side, you're going to have Devondre Campbell, and then if need be, you'll have Beasley out there. But, I don't see why they don't just carry 5 true linebackers and have Beasley as kind of that hybrid linebacker end and not even worry about carrying a 6th guy. It'd be great to have a guy like Josh Keys or Jermaine Grace or any of these guys on the roster as a special teams guy. But I think if you put one of these guys on the roster, they're just going to be inactive every game. You might as well just not waste the roster spot and have another safety or have another corner, especially with the amount of nickel and dime that Dan Quinn and Marquand Manuel are going to run.
Okay. Let's move to the secondary. I think this is going to be a little bit more of at least for me, it's going to be a little bit more of an interesting competition because we know the starters are going to be, I'm not buying at all the notion that some people think Ricardo Allen's going to be competing for his starting job. I think it's really just going to be how the depth stacks up, and you have multiple guys competing at nickel corner: Brian Poole, Jalen Collins, DeMonte Casey. Obviously, if Collins is the best, he's not going to be a slot corner. But he's going to play on the outside, and that's going to prompt Robert Alford to move into the slot. I think, I imagine that's the goal, to have Collins, wind up outplaying Poole. But, it's interesting that when you've heard Marquand Manuel quotes this summer in the spring about that nickel cornerback position, he's talking about Brian Poole being that third corner and Jalen Collins being more of a dime guy. So it'll be interesting to see if they're sort of forcing Collins to have to win the job, or, maybe for whatever reason, maybe Collins has not quite fulfilled what they wanted him to do through OTAs or whatnot. So we'll see how that plays out when training camp comes. And then you have the depth with CJ Goodwin and Deji Olatoye and Bleedy Ray Wilson and Akeem King also there fighting for reserve spots at that cornerback position where, there's the possibility that, particularly with guys like Goodwin and Olatoye, the Falcons might wind up cutting a really good cornerback just because they have so much talent at that position, so much depth at that position. Even guys like Bleedy Ray Wilson, who's been a veteran in this league, and Akeem King, who once upon a time people thought had the potential to be the team's nickel cornerback before he got injured last summer. So we'll see how it plays out. Scott, I'm curious, what are your thoughts on sort of the competition at cornerback, and do you have any thoughts if it maybe bleed over to safety position?
I think it will. I think you're going to have probably 4 true cornerbacks make the roster. Your Jalen Collins, your Desmond Trufant. So Collins, Trufant. Obviously, you're going to have Alford. Those 3 guys are pretty much set in stone. I think Goodwin is probably going to be that 4th true corner, unless either Olatoye, Ray Wilson, or King just beat him out. At safety, you've got Allen and Neal. They're starting, obviously. But strong safety, there's like 10 guys competing for the job. Free safety, there's like 3 or 4 guys competing for the job. I think DeMonte Casey, Brian Poole, they're kind of those cornerback safety hybrids that, you've got 4 true corners, you're going to have 4 true safeties, and you have those 2 guys who can play corner, safety, nickel. And I think long term, they kind of see a Tyrann Mathieu light in DeMonte Casey. He's just very instinctual, very intelligent, gets in the right spot. He's got good quickness. He's not afraid to hit anybody. And I think he's just a good fit. So if it was up to me, I think you would end up with quite a few different people out there.
Tim, what are your thoughts on the competition in the secondary?
I think what makes it unique is we have a number of guys who are positionless, sort of. This is a trend we saw. I think Arizona does really well. We mentioned Tyrann Mathieu a moment ago. Brian Poole, KZ, Keanu O'Neal, they all play like several different spots. Like Neal played 5 different spots last year. He played a lot of linebacker too. He's in the slot. He was outside. He was free safety. He was strong safety. He was everywhere. I think it's very important to have guys who can do those multiple positions, and it's going to be really interesting to see. What I'm most interested to see is my feeling is that Brian Poole and KZ are going to switch back and forth between this nickel spot and dropping back into safety, perhaps in dime, or these 3 safety sets that we've heard a little bit about after the offseason from Dan Quinn. Whoever gets the split of time between those two, my money's still on Poole. He's a year ahead of Kazee, but easy to let. Everyone is very excited about him. I think for 5th round pick, I don't know if I've ever heard like this amount of hype for 5th round DB coming out of a relatively small school. So I'm pretty interested to see what he's going to do. But yeah, like I don't want to keep coming back to it, but I feel like this is kind of an embarrassment of riches that they have in the secondary here. You have so many different pieces. They are deep at corner here. They are less deep at safety, but they are still relatively deep, for as far as the other NFC contenders go. So yeah, they're very lucky, and I think this is probably the deepest, maybe aside from running up, maybe the deepest unit on the team.
Okay. I think we talked a little bit about this before, but I'm curious, what are your thoughts on, if you were putting money on it, Tim, who would you pick to be the kick returner / punt returner this year?
I think it's probably going to be Robert, just because, the nature of his contract says they're going to give him a pretty fair chance to do that. Everyone else is kind of a bargain, so they want him to earn his money there. And it's not going to be a wide receiver. There's just no room for him. I mean, he's going to be a number 5 or number 6 at best behind all those other guys. So if he's going to earn his money, it has to be as a returner, and he has to do pretty well at it too. There's a reason why it's a 1-year thing. If he doesn't work out, they're probably likely to cut him, before the end of the year. So he's underperformed there, and he's probably my number 1. But Gabriel, I don't know why. I just feel like there's nobody on the team who's quite as shifty as he is in the open field. He's just so much more elusive than anyone else on the team. That makes me think that he can be, especially on punt returns. But that would be my guess. I'd say Roberts probably kick returner and Gabriel punt returner. But who knows? We'll see how it plays out.
I already know who Scott's going to pick because he's going to go with the Citadel guy. So don't even need to ask him on that one.
I also think contract dictates this one. Andre signed for over $1 million. He's the most experienced out of anybody on the team there. I think kick returner is guaranteed his. Kick returner. Punt returner, on the other hand, it could be anybody. It could be Roberts. It could be Williams. It could be Hardy. I don't know on punt returner because Hardy could just beat him out. B.J. Daniels could just beat him out. Reggie Davis could just beat him out there. And that's fine. Because I think Andre's going to play on offense a lot more than Eric Weems ever did.
Fair enough. So let's get more broad topics. What are some of the key storylines that you guys are looking forward to this summer? One of the big ones for me is when is Takk McKinley going to be healthy, and when are we going to see him play? I think Dimitroff came out the other day and said that they're planning on getting him ready to play in that 3rd preseason game. That sort of cuts the margin a little slim. If there's any sort of setback, we'll see how that goes. So I'm definitely looking forward to seeing what he does when he gets on the field. I know people have been talking quite a bit about Dwight Freeney coming back. I've never really sort of bought into the Falcons being that interested in bringing Freeney back, but I think that's tied very much to, Tack McKinley in sort of his recovery. So are there any other storylines that you guys, Tim, that you're looking forward to this summer?
I think the big one you have to mention is the changeover in the coaching staff. Obviously, the biggest one is Kyle Shanahan in place for Steve Sarkisian, but they were the only one. Both coordinators turned over. A number of position coaches have changed. Quinn is still the top, and I think they're going to keep the same organization. I don't imagine after going to the Super Bowl they're going to change up too much of these things. But the biggest question to me is how Sarkisian manages this transition. Shanahan did an amazing job during, up until the very, very, very end of it. This is an all-time great offense. It's top 10 in scoring all time. They scorched at what was a very, very good, very stacked NFC conference in the playoffs. It wasn't even close. So you have to keep that going. You have to keep what he did working. I think it's a good idea to keep a lot of the same terminology. Keep it simple for Matt Ryan. They simplified his read a lot last year, and I think that was a big part of his progression to having his, the best year he's ever had, obviously. The big rub is how much of it does he need to change. I think you need to talk a little bit about Julio Jones getting more looks in the red zone, which seems obvious. From my experience, the Super Bowl wasn't the first time that they had problems with running the ball late with a lead. That was the thing that definitely happened throughout 2016. They had some fourth quarter issues holding on the leads. So you have to add little wrinkles like that and little strategic adjustments. But in general, you want to keep that going the same way that Shanahan as much as possible. So that's, to me, the biggest question. If he can do that, they're going to be just fine. If not, it's kind of a coin toss how this year is going to go.
Okay. Scott, where do you come in on some of these big picture stuff?
I mean, the coordinators are important. I'm not too worried about Sarkisian being that different just because the offenses he ran in college when he could finally get the guys he wanted on the line were very inside zone, outside zone heavy. So I think he's going to run a lot of two tight end. I think we're going to see a lot more sets with run pass options where Ryan comes up to the line, he's got 2 play calls in his helmet, and he has to tell everybody, hey, 1 or 2. It's where Ryan can finally be that Peyton Manning type guy who runs the offense from the line like he should be. So I think that's going to be great. And I think that it's going to be a great fit for the Falcons long term to have Sarkisian as that offensive coordinator.
Okay. All right, we got another mailbag question from Evan Burfield, of course. He asked if there's a surprise cut/release during training camp, who is it?
Adrian Claiborne.
Okay, that would be a surprise, at least to me. Tim, you got anybody on your list?
I think Brooks Reed is number 1 on my list. Even if he does play well, I think he's kind of in a tight spot given, the depth, the talent they have. Assuming Tack is the guy that they drafted him to be, they wouldn't have traded up if they didn't think he was going to be something special. They consider themselves very lucky to get him. So I think Reed's kind of under the 8 ball, and it may have more to do with his contract than anything else. I think they can next 3 years, just something like $13 million cap hits. That just kind of makes him an easy target. Whether he needs to. He needs to impress in order to justify that. He needs to really produce. So I think that's probably number 1 on my list.
Okay, I'll keep it 3 defensive linemen for 3. I'll go with Rashid Hageman.
I don't really see that happening.
Well, I don't see Adrian Claiborne getting cut, so.
I just think Hageman finally got his shit together last year in the playoffs and was like, this is what I'm supposed to do. And they finally started using him at the 1 tech, and that's where he should be.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the issue that Hageman's going to have to deal with, I don't think Hageman's going to get cut, but we're picking surprise cuts. So I got to go out on a limb, and I would put him, a little closer to the bubble than probably people think. I think, with the addition of Poe, with the addition of Crawford, with Upshaw coming on as well, with Jarrett, coming on, I think, there's very easily that you could see Hageman get marginalized a little bit, especially if Shelby comes back strong as well. So it's one of those things where I think if he doesn't have a good summer, he's not guaranteed a roster spot. So, I'm not expecting him to have a bad summer, but it's one of those things where I think if he sort of reverts back to his, worser days or whatever and struggles or whatever, then I don't feel the Falcons are going to be necessarily tied to keeping him around just because he's in a contract year and there's no guarantee that he was going to come back next year anyway. So we'll see. All right, let's get into the rest of these mailbag questions. The first one comes from Jesse Lalamindre at Fonzie1998 on Twitter. He asks, if you guys could only choose one, what game would you choose to go see in the new stadium this year?
That Saints game. Just screaming and yelling at Saints fans and talking shit. Like, that's my type of game. I'm always down for a rivalry. I'm always down to get fired up and just fucking scream at people. So let's do that Saints game. Everybody, let's go. Come on.
Tim, who do you got?
I like a good rivalry, but I think I would go with the Cowboys. Didn't get to see them in the playoffs last year. That was supposed to be the big showdown, right? According to Des Bryant, they were the only team that could have beaten the Falcons. But the NFL is better when the Cowboys are better. I watched the Thanksgiving game last year with an uncle of mine who's a Cowboys fan. Like, it's just more fun when they're good. You want to root against them. I don't necessarily want the Cowboys to win anything, but you want them to be competitive so you can see them lose on a bigger stage. They have two great guys in the backfield. They have a great offense. I think these two teams could lead the league in scoring. I would just love to see the matchup. I think, just pure entertainment factor, that'd probably be my favorite for sure.
Yeah, that's a good choice. I'll be the oddball. I'll go with a sort of a game that I doubt many people are looking forward to. I'll go with the Vikings because I think the Vikings, basically the last two times we played them, they shut down the Falcons offense. And I'd be curious to see, if Sarkisian in this offense has sort of developed enough to sort of not have that happen again. I do think the Vikings are going to be a good team. That's a good matchup. Julio versus Xavier Rhodes. Rhodes has probably done a better job against Julio than any cornerback in the league right now. So that's a great matchup there. Dalvin Cook, I think he's going to be good this year. Our offensive line versus their defensive line. Our defensive line versus their offensive line. That would be a fun game as well. So I think, that my Vikings game, even though it's probably a little low key to a lot of people, I think that could wind up being one of the better games of the season this year. All right, the next question is from the early bird at Wade's for World or whatever his name is on Twitter. Whatever, I can't read. All right, with the ability to make stats say just about anything used correctly or incorrectly, what would be the most telling stat as to how good this team is and how well they will do this season?
What?
Oh. I think what he's asking, what's the most telling stat to determine how good the team is. I would say, for me, if you're looking for the stat that correlates the most to winning in the NFL, it's either passer rating differential or adjusted net yards per attempt, aka ANYA differential. So you look at the offensive passer rating and subtract the defensive passer rating. And so that tells you is the most telling stat over whether a team is good or not. The bigger that gap is between how good your offense is versus how good your offenses are against your defenses, that's usually the most telling stat. So if I think if that's the question you're asking, that would be the question. That would be the stat I would pay the most attention to. You guys?
Yeah. For me, it's as simple as this: points allowed versus points scored. That's how you know how good your team is. Whoever allows the most points probably has the worst defense. Whoever scores the most points probably has the best offense.
There you go. Tim, you got any stats that you particularly pay attention to?
I don't know. This isn't a traditional kind of stat. My mind goes to the DVOA rating from Football Outsiders. This is a little bit more advanced, maybe, but it's about efficiency as opposed to just pure, tallying numbers kind of thing, but that's a very good way of knowing how good your roster is and how good your team is compared to other you. Like Julio and Gabriel were number 1 and number 2 and DPO at their position. I think Ryan was number 1 his. It's just a great way to see. It doesn't necessarily measure like touchdowns and points and whatnot like that. It counts for the time you're on the field and a number of other factors, weather, and lots of such stuff goes into it. And the Falcons rate pretty highly and across the line there. That's one of my favorites for sure.
Okay. Schlink Johnson at ATL Sports 404 on Twitter asks, have we seen the last of Teron Ward in a Falcons uniform, or could Atlanta carry 4 running backs this year?
I mean, it's possible Atlanta carries 4 running backs. I wouldn't be shocked to see it go down that way. And if they say carry 4 running backs instead of, I don't know, a fullback or a 6th wide receiver or one of those kind of things, I don't really see it happening.
Tim?
Yeah, I mean, it'd be one thing if you didn't have Devonta Freeman and Tevin Coleman as the number 1 and number 2. They're rarely going to be off the field at any point. So it seems kind of like overkill carrying forward when those are your top 2. It'd be one thing if your backup wasn't Devin Coleman. If you had someone, it's kind of a downgrade there. But keeping 4 with those 2 at the top, it just seems like I'd rather see them add another edge rusher or maybe another someone who can back up at right guard or left guard. I just think they can better spend that roster spot somewhere else.
I think they will keep 4. I think it's possible, certainly, that they will only keep 3. It certainly makes sense from a number standpoint to only keep 3, given the quality of the top 2 guys, as Tim just said. But I do think when you look at that offensive roster, they're really, we talk about how deep this team is, but outside of wide receiver, outside of tight end, the depth on the offense is not as strong as the depth on the defense is. And so when it comes down to it, I think, when you build your roster, you're building for your 46-man, not necessarily for your 53-man. And I think among the guys that will potentially be on the bubble offensively, you look at Teron Ward, and we've seen for the last 2 years that he's more than capable of being a guy that can compete on that 46-man roster. Who's the 6th wide receiver, whether that's Devin Fuller or Nick Williams. I don't know if that's necessarily a guy that the Falcons are intrigued to keep on their 46-man roster. A 3rd-string running back, I don't know about that. An extra tight end. They got Alex Gray on the practice squad. They already have too many bodies at tight end to begin with. So, keeping an undrafted rookie, that may be one twisted ankle away from being on the game day roster. I don't know about that. I just think Teron Ward has been a guy for this coaching staff. He's basically their Jason Snelling. He's not as good as Jason Snelling, but, when they've called upon him to step up, he has stepped up each of the last 2 years. So it will be difficult for me to see them just basically cut him just because they want to keep another guy inactive for the rest of the season at a position that's a guy that's not really going to play at all this year. So, I think it's possible he'll get cut. Certainly, it's probably a coin toss at this point, but I would think the chances of them keeping 4 running backs is probably stronger than a lot of people think. All right. Schlink asks, this next question is, last year Tevin Coleman was the breakout player on offense. Who could be that guy this year?
Austin Hooper. I think he's primed to have that ridiculous season. I think that's going to make it's going to make the offense much better. But, I mean, if you just take the targets that he got and you take the targets that Jacob Tamme got and give him those 60 targets, you could easily see a guy who's got 45 catches, 500 yards, 6 touchdowns. Which, for a guy at tight end, that's a really good season.
Yeah, it's Austin Hooper. Assuming everyone else is healthy, if someone like one of the top 3 wide receivers gets hurt, I could see Justin Hardy as a potential breakout. He's a very talented guy. I think he had 4 touchdowns last year. With more targets, he could definitely do a lot more. But assuming everyone else, is starting the way we expect them to, it's going to be Hooper.
Yeah, I'll make it 3 for 3. Yeah, Hooper is the obvious candidate. I'm with you on that, Tim. If there is an injury at wide receiver, I think Justin Hardy is more than capable of being the number 2 on this team, as opposed to another current number 2 receiver. But I think Hooper is obviously the best breakout candidate. If we're looking at that, it's hard to say an offensive lineman is a breakout candidate. Because they're offensive linemen. So next question from ATL Sports 404 is what is the floor and ceiling for the Falcons secondary?
Floor is probably the 3rd or 4th best secondary performance in the NFL. Ceiling, shoot. I would say their ceiling is probably the best secondary in the NFL, and they've got talent at safety. They've got the talent at corner to be that good all around. So I don't see why they can't at least compete for those roles, compete to be one of the best secondaries. Like, this is potential to be Legion of Boom good.
Tim, what do you think?
I would agree. The ceiling is the best in the league. I'm not quite ready to put them ahead of Denver or Seattle right now. I just think they've proven themselves a little bit more. The Falcons had one good half of 1 year in a playoff run. These other teams have been doing it for several years now and have a lot of very talented future Hall of Famers on their squads. But as far as their basement goes, I think at very worst it's going to be an average secondary, assuming the very, very worst happens, if there are injuries, if there's regression, if there's who knows what happened. Marquand Manuel gets sick. They have a new coordinator come in. Everything gets screwed up. I think at very worst, assuming, if you're going to write a Greek tragedy, at worst, they're going to be an average secondary over the next 3 or 4 years. They're going to should be very, very good. At worst, they're going to be average.
Yeah, I don't know exactly where I would put them in the rankings, but the floor is what they were last year, which was a pretty good secondary, which was probably one of the 10 best in the league, maybe even the 5 best in the league. So, that's their floor. Their ceiling is sort of, I guess would qualify as being the best secondary in the league, but it's really less about where they rank, but, how many plays they make. If they're, being ball hawks, if Keanu Neal's forcing fumbles and the Falcons are recovering them, last year he forced 5 fumbles, but the Falcons, I think, only recovered 1 of them. If Desmond Trufant is sort of picking off passes instead of dropping them, if Robert Alford's making those plays, if Ricardo Allen's being more opportunistic and sort of, breaking up throws and getting picks, if whoever is the nickel cornerback is also doing the same thing. So, that's, to me, their ceiling. If that's the best secondary in the league, then so be it. If that's the 3rd best secondary, who really cares? As long as you're making plays, that's really the most important thing. So, I think that's their ceiling.
I agree.
Schlink asks, if you had to bet on either Jalen Collins, Justin Hardy, or Tevin Coleman not getting a second contract with the Falcons, who would it be?
Ooh, that's tough. I'd say Tevin Coleman.
I agree. I think Coleman is the guy there, too. There's just he's not going to supplant Devonta Freeman. Who knows exactly what he's going to get over the next few weeks, but it's going to be a lot of money over at least the next 4 or 5 years. I don't see them paying both of them right now. Maybe he can get he's willing to take a hometown discount or something like that. Who knows what can happen? But I don't see them paying both of them long-term extensions for sure.
Okay. Yeah, Coleman is an obvious choice. I think Dimitroff might pull a Marty Herney and pay both Freeman and Coleman. I'll pick Justin Hardy just to be different, just because that would be the one that hurts me the most, because it would probably mean that we'd get 3 more years of Mohamed Sanu as the Falcons' number 2 receiver. So that would be the one, and usually I think Dimitroff does a lot of things just to spite me, because I've been so critical of him over the years. So that would probably be the guy I put my money on. All right. The next question from ATL Sports 404 asks, what's a realistic expectation for Derek Shelby in training camp / preseason this year coming off the Achilles injury?
Oh. Maybe 3 sacks and some solid run defense, if we're being generous.
Tim?
Yeah, I would say that's probably his ceiling. Achilles injuries are notoriously tough to predict how they're going to affect you. Some guys can come back. Some guys, that's finally what ended Kobe Bryant's career. Like, he would have played until he was 89 if you let him, but his Achilles, that second to last year he had, that finally he just couldn't play at the same level anymore. If that happens to Shelby, he'll probably be cut before week 5. It's a very short shelf life for these guys, especially when you have as much depth on the defensive line as these Falcons do. Yeah, I think 3 sacks is ceiling. I think at worst he may get cut here in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see where Shelby is, because we've seen guys like Corey Peters come back and be fine. We've seen guys like Corey Bierman come back a little slow, but by the second half of that 2014 season, despite what a lot of people think, he was playing. He was probably our 3rd or 4th best defensive player. Now, granted, we were the worst defense in the league, so that might not be saying a whole lot. But it'll be interesting to see sort of on that spectrum where Shelby sort of comes back. Cameron Wake came back and was a monster last year. He was one of the best pass rushers in the league coming off an Achilles injury. So it certainly can be done. Whether Shelby is going to, be in that camp is sort of anybody's guess. As far as where he's going to be in training camp and preseason, I don't know. I think his contract is structured in a way that I would be surprised if he's cut, because the Falcons would have to eat some salary that I don't think they plan on eating. But he could be limited in a lot of ways this summer. So, I don't know what a realistic expectation is. I guess a realistic expectation is he'll practice, but whether or not he'll be, you'll notice him in any of the games or whatnot, I have no idea. So we'll see. All right, we got one more from Schlink. He asks, one thing no one is really talking about is how our tight end depth has taken a hit. Is this a concern?
I mean,
I think Cooper's going to make it okay. Saubert, who knows how that's going to play out, but it's not a major concern for me. Even if they are kind of like weak at tight end, they're stacked at wide receiver, they're stacked at running back, they have a good offensive line. There's no real need to splurge there. I think as long as Hooper's healthy and performs the way you think they do, they're going to be just fine there.
Scott?
Yeah, I'm not really worried about tight end as long as Hooper does his thing. And Sobert could be one of those very unique football players that comes out of college and nobody really knows who he is because he went to D2 Drake, but the dude can play. And he's athletically very comparable, and I'm going to get some shit for saying this from Aaron, I know. He's athletically comparable to Gronk. He's got that big body. He's quick off his breaks, but he's not going to burn the defense like Gronk. He's like a poor man's version there. He doesn't have the top end speed. He doesn't have the same kind of fluidity in his movement, but Gronk's just a freak. Now, his blocking sucks right now. He's more of a move tight end, but I think the Falcons can do something with Sobert to where he's a solid number 2 that they have.
Okay. I'll let the Gronk comp. I know why you made it. You're right. He tested similar to Gronk.
Athletically,
I got it.
Similar to Gronk. I'm not saying on the field he's the same. Gronk is miles and miles above.
I get it. We've had this conversation, this debate before, so I'll let it go. Look, I said it earlier. I sort of disagree with what Scott and Tim said. I do think depth is a concern because I do think if Hooper does get injured, as I said before, Toilolo's not bringing nothing to the table. I like Levine Toilolo, but we know he's not bringing much to the table. I know he made plays last year, but I think if anybody is a candidate for major regression this year, it's going to be Levine Toilolo. I doubt he's going to average 20 yards per reception this year and have 3 or 4 touchdowns. Maybe I could be wrong, but I just think it's going to be important for guys like Saubert and Perkins to sort of step. I think they had the ability to do so, but it's a big step up. We saw Perkins last year. He flashed potential. He dropped a couple of passes. His blocking wasn't quite up to par. Saubert's blocking, I think, is a little bit better at this point, but questions whether that's going to be up to par, and whether or not he's going to be as sort of skilled running the offense in the event of a Hooper injury. So I do think the depth at tight end is a concern. I think long term, it's good. You got some young guys that you can develop for the future, as Tim said earlier in the show. So I think long term, the depth is not really an issue. But I do think maybe for 2017, if Hooper was to be out for a month or so because of a twisted ankle or something like that, then I think the tight end position, you could basically erase it from the offense because it's not going to be much of a factor at that point. So that is a concern going into the summer for me, at least. Hopefully, Sauber or Perkins sort of steps up and sort of quiets those concerns for me. All right, we got another one from Evan Birchfield. He says, I don't know much about Tim, but it says he's a fantasy football enthusiast. Give me a sleeper to the draft.
Oh man, now we're talking. I'm buying very hard on this Giants wide receiver core they have this year. They added Brandon Marshall, who has put up some amazing numbers with some very terrible quarterbacks in his career. So we assume he's going to keep being productive, and defenses need to account for him. And he's going to be the number 2. We know what Odell Beckham is going to do. So for me, my very favorite sleeper is going to be Sterling Shepard. He's their number 3. He was a rookie last year. He had some pretty impressive highlight reel catches. I just think he's going to see a lot of single coverage. He's going to, you have to double team Brandon Marshall and Odell Beckham sometimes. They can both command that kind of deep, attention. I don't imagine you can do both at the same time. But either way, Shepard is going to see a lot of open field. He's going to see a lot of one-on-ones, and he's got the kind of tools to make him pay for that. So he's my favorite sleeper as far as non-Falcons are concerned this year. I'm definitely very high on him.
Okay. There you go. I'm terrible at fantasy football, so you don't want any tips from me. So, Scott, do you got any fantasy football sleepers that you're looking at?
I mean, you say you're awful at it. You've done pretty well in the league the last couple of years.
Well, that's more a comment on the people that we have in the league, not necessarily my skills as a fantasy football player.
That's true. We are going to have Tim in our league this year, so that's going to be some fun.
Look out.
Yeah, he might actually win it. I'm going to get some flack for this because I'm picking a Panther, but I think if you took Curtis Samuel, you have a very fun time.
There you go. All right, last question comes from Evan Birchfield. I guess this is kind of a fantasy question. He asked, over or under, Matt Ryan throws over 550 passes this season?
Over. I think he was at like 535 last year, but I wouldn't expect him to have less passes under Sarkisian. I think he's going to go back to his more normal, like 600, 620 passes.
Tim?
I don't know. Maybe this is just my gut. I'm going to go under. This is maybe a hope. Like I mentioned earlier, like they had a problem with running the ball in the fourth quarter. I have to think that's something that they realize happened that they need to address. If they're willing to give the ball to Freeman and hand it off more in the fourth quarter, he's going to see less passes because they're going to have the lead. It's a good team. They're going to have the lead late in games, and if they can make that adjustment, I don't know how big of an impact it will be, but I can definitely see Ryan throwing less than he did last year, if not significantly less.
Fair enough. Yeah, I'm going to go over. I think last year was sort of unique. I sort of expect to see a little bit more increased passing this year with the changes that Sarkisian's going to bring. But I do like where your head's at, Tim. I do think if it is under, that will be a positive sign that the defense has really sort of stepped up and sort of been able to keep those leads a little bit later in games, because I don't expect the Falcons offense to basically blow teams out like they did at certain points last year, midway through the second quarter where we're up like 3 scores and whatnot and the game is pretty much over. I don't expect that to happen as much this year. So if they're able to keep leads into the second half, I think it will be because the defense is continuing to get stops more so than the offense is just continuing to rack up points. All right, that is our show. We want to thank Tim for coming on and giving us his time and giving us his insights. Tim, as the editor at the Falcons Wire and the Panthers Wire, what do you have on deck, and where can people find you on Twitter?
Just working for the next 8 months nonstop. I'm on Twitter at TimWeaver84.
Okay. Well, Tim, we appreciate you coming on and giving us your thoughts. You're a great guest. We probably will get you back on at some point during the regular season so we can actually talk about games instead of speculating about training camp battles.
Sure. I'd like that. Thank you.
All right, guys, you know what to do. If you want to send in your mailbag questions, you can back. The show's Twitter handle is at FalconsPFC. My Twitter handle is at FalcFan. Scott is at Karasik S. That probably is somewhere on your screen. I don't know what direction it is if you're watching this. So keep up with us on ProFootballCentral.com. Subscribe to us on iTunes. Give us a thumbs up on YouTube. Subscribe on YouTube at Pro Football Central's YouTube page. You can check us out on Facebook Live. Every week we're going to go back to the weekly formats as we're through the rest of the season. I know you guys have been sort of hungering for us, with these every other week shows that we've done all summer, but we will be back to the weekly show. So you will hear us talking next Tuesday about the first week of training camp or the first few days of training camp. So look forward to that, and we will talk.